Hi everybody, this is Johnnie. I put together some materials for you to be successful on CalTPA Cycle 1. Hope they're useful to you. To start, do look in the video description below to find the link to access all of these materials. I wish you the best. When you follow the link, you come to this overview that I've set out for you. This is a guide to take you through using these materials to be successful on CalTPA Cycle 1. Do start by clicking on this link. It will take you to all of the materials I've set out for you. You can see there are a lot of good things here for you. Let's start at the top. First thing I have is a Cycle 1 rubric for self-assessment. This will take you through all the requirements of the Cycle 1, and you get to mark yourself and see how you've done. The second one is all about the rubrics themselves. Each rubric I've marked up in detail with suggestions about how you might approach them. I've set out a frame for you for lesson planning. I think the structure is really good and sets you up to use all the elements that are necessary for Cycle 1. This is the overview that we started with. Here are the rubrics for CalTPA Cycle 1. Each one of them I've taken apart to pieces, marked it up in detail, and give you suggestions on how to approach these for success. Here are the 5 templates. Each one of them I've turned into a workbook, and in the workbooks you will see each prompt is taken down to its pieces with lots of suggestions on how you might approach the prompts. Here, I give you 2 tools to think about your video requirement. Each one of them helps you think about the annotations and what you might look for and how you might mark them. And lastly, I set out a workbook with the knowledge base of key terms and ideas that show up in Cycle 1 around funds of knowledge, UDL, cultural linguistic resources, all the things that you need to be thinking about as you approach your planning and your teaching. So there's a lot of good things here, and I hope they're useful to you. So that's an overview of the preparation materials I've organized for you. Let's look through a scheme to help you prepare for Cycle 1. Here's what I suggest. Start by reading through the assessment guide provided by the program. It has a lot of detail in it. Do go through it in a way that makes good sense to you, knowing that when you use the workbooks and tools and guides that I set out, they'll make more sense to you. The whole guide will make more sense to you. After that, I have suggestions for how to use the tools I've set out. My first suggestion is to go over the lesson plan frame. Here I set out a lesson plan frame for you. Remember, you can copy all the charts as you need for checklists. First thing you'll find here are all the necessary elements you need to have for Cycle 1 lesson. Second, a frame that's organized by beginning, middle, and closing of a lesson. And lastly, I set out an example lesson where I describe actual teaching and all the elements and where they fit. So you can see in the first section here, I set out all the necessary elements for the lesson, and I've color-coded them based on the requirements for Cycle 1, whether they're for the video, for the lesson plan rationale reflection. Everything's organized here. You do all of these things in your lesson and in your planning, and you'll have a successful lesson for CalTPA. I follow with the lesson plan frame, beginning, body of the lesson, closure, and I describe things that should happen in the lesson at different points. So starting the lesson by making a connection with your kids and their personal lives, prior learning, setting expectations, hook or essential question. You can see the body of the lesson, setting out ideas, working with students during modeling, engaging students in learning activity, deepening their learning through questions and activity, checks for understanding, and then closing the lesson by revisiting the goals for the learning, and reflecting on the learning with the students about how well they did for themselves, and then setting out steps for the next lesson. And I close this piece with a story about a lesson. And as this teacher is teaching, you can see I've marked out where all the necessary elements show up in this lesson. Hope this one is useful to you. Going back to the overview, we've looked over how to think about the lesson plan frame. Second thing I suggest, and all of this is before you do any writing, any consideration of the templates, is just to get your head around Cycle 1 well. So the second thing I suggest is to read through all the 8 rubrics. I suggest that this is a must. Everything in the rubrics is what counts towards your score, nothing else. Give good attention to the rubrics and your score will be strong. So let's take a look at some of the rubrics right now. If we go here, this will take us back to our large folder. We can take any one of the rubrics, and I'm going to go to show you one at the moment. I'm going to take 1.5 would be a worthwhile one to look at. So this is a workbook for rubric 1.5, and you can see that I've set out scores for levels 3 and above, because the assessment only counts scores really that are above 3 and count 4s and 5s as well. You are allowed a couple 2s, but you really should be working towards 3s at least. And so this is the most important part. To receive a score of level 3, you must include every element within that lesson. That's repeated throughout. And you'll see that it's marked up really strongly in my markup here. I'm going to suggest using checklists to make sure you include every element. And my other suggestion is going for 4s and 5s. Turns out 4s and 5s only require a little more work. And if you get a 4 or a 5, that gives a buffer to your score. You can see that every rubric will describe what kinds of evidence matter to this. In this one, 1.5, this is all about your annotations, particular annotations from the set of required annotations. And I say that here, this rubric is all about your video annotations. You will see my blow up, my takedown, take apart of this particular rubric. You see level 3. These are the absolute required elements. And you can see if it's pink here, I have pink over here, and this is a description of what you might be thinking about. It's green here, I mark green over here, what you might be thinking about. Blue here, what you might be thinking about. And then I give a breakdown for level 4 requirements. You'll see in these blocks there are 2 requirements for 4. Here's my suggestion. I suggest which annotations you might use. And then level 5, the same thing. There's 1 requirement here. I suggest an annotation and ways to approach. Now, to break this down even further, I take each one of the levels and make it much more explicit down here. So this is a way for you to check and make notes for each of these. So as I was saying, level 3 had 3 required elements. Here are my descriptions. You can make notes over here for yourself. Level 4 has 2 elements, and my descriptions for each of those 2 elements, place for notes or marking. And level 5, my description again about what level 5 requires, and a place for you to make notes and to check your work. So each one of the rubrics is handled in this way. So that was rubric 1.5. You can see that rubric 1.6 is organized similarly. The requirements for level 3, the requirements for level 4, and the requirements for level 5. Remember, do reach for 4s and 5s. They will bolster your scores. So my second suggestion was to read through all the 8 rubric breakdowns that I have set out. Again, the third piece is about work you do before any planning, any teaching. And this one's important too. So this is all front-loading your CalTPA work. Let's look at the workbook for CalTPA Knowledge Base. So Cycle 1 is built around some key ideas, very specific kinds of ideas around teaching that Cycle 1 is looking for. And I've broken those down, brought them out of the assessment so you could look at them in more close detail. A really significant one is higher order thinking. I follow by why it matters. Then I follow with some general definition of what that is, higher order thinking. And then I set out resources. Now what's useful about the resources I set out for these is they all talk about strategies, ways to approach this kind of teaching. So how do you make higher order thinking happen in your classroom with your students? Each of these resources I have down here gives ideas. And then for the workbook part, I set out what deep learning is available in the topic you are teaching, what activities will set up students for deep learning. I ask questions that you might work out here. This is the workbook part. You do your thinking here early on, making sure that you understand higher order thinking well, so that when you go to your planning and your teaching, you're well set to do right by them. So I have something for higher order thinking, funds of knowledge as well, comes up a lot. UDL is laced throughout the assessment. If you want to get scores of 5, you need to be thinking about UDL all throughout. And you can see I have my guiding questions below. Academic language is throughout the assessment as well. You can see my resources here, lots of strategies, guiding questions. Cultural and linguistic resources, my resources here for the resources and guiding questions. Evidence-based strategies. And then down here, this would be useful to you in general in your planning. These are links to the standards documents for the state of California. So now we've done 3. And this is the workbook for CalTPA Knowledge Base. Now we're going to get to work, and the first work is about consulting with your mentor teacher. So my suggestion is work with your mentor teacher to decide upon a lesson to teach. It may be a lesson from a given set curriculum. You will embellish this lesson with attention to higher order thinking, access and support for all students, particularly your focus students. You will structure the lesson to begin with attention to prior knowledge, setting a worthwhile learning environment, setting learning expectations. You will mark moments to check for understanding, asking questions to promote higher order thinking, and encourage student shared talk and interaction. You will close by setting out next steps for student learning. Use the lesson plan frame as a guide to organize your lesson. Plan with your mentor teachers or in collaboration with peers. So the lesson plan frame is something I've shared with you already. And as you saw before, I've given you a beginning, a middle, and closure outline structure for this lesson that you might find useful. The other thing to do before you get to your planning or working any of the templates is to read through the reflection template workbook so you have an idea of other things that you should be considering and being prepared to think about in your planning and your teaching. So here's the reflection template workbook. So this is the reflection on what you learned workbook. Each of the workbooks is organized like this. I'll be giving you sentence starters to just get you started on writing them, and they're just starters. Use your own language and ideas to complete. Anything that I highlight and give attention to in bold print or exclamation points, important, those are things that count heavily on the rubrics. I set out these blue and orange tables. These are workspaces for you. These will map onto the gray prompts from the CalTPA templates, and you'll see this in just a moment. So each one of the sections will have prompts or boxes, tables like this. So here's an example. This is reflection on what you learned, and then my highlighting's very clear here, evidence, evidence, evidence. Especially for the last 2 rubrics, 1.7 and 1.8, you want to be reflecting through your lesson plans, your lesson plan rationale, and most importantly, time-stamped instances from your videos. Okay, and this particular one maps straight onto 1.7, so you want to do well. So you will see here, the rubrics essential question is, how does the candidate reflect on, citing evidence from steps 1 or 2, the impact of assets, needs-based planning, teaching, and formal assessment of student learning, and analyze how effective the lesson was in supporting the whole class and the 3 focus students. So this gives you a frame for what this is about. The actual prompts, and this is an important part, are in gray. So in the template, you'll find these gray prompts. The big idea behind these prompts is that they often ask more than one thing. So even if we look at this first one, how did getting to know your students' assets and learning needs, you'll notice there's assets, and then there's an and learning needs. That means you should address both of those. And you'll see there are 2 parts. A, support the affirmation and validation of the students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds. And B, allowed students to access and engage the content. So essentially, you want to think about assets and needs for each of these 2, which means there's 4 things that need to be addressed in prompt 1. And so I write that out for you. And then for this prompt A, you'll see that I break it down. Then I suggest to you what you might think about in terms of cultural background. Then for linguistic background, I do the same thing. And so that's part A. You can see prompt A here was about cultural linguistic backgrounds, thinking about assets and learning needs. But you'll see also that prompt B is here as well. Allow students to access and engage the content. After addressing prompt A, I set out this for access. Start with your planning. I make suggestions all along the way. And remember, the two things that count for this are access and then engagement. And so I set all of this out again. Access and suggestions about UDL with a link to those things. And you can see the second part was engagement. And then I set out guides for you to write up. This is your workbook part. These prompts here set you up to address those gray shaded template prompts. You can see the second question for this one. There's a prompt here, and it says, how effective was your instructional approach in supporting learning for the whole class and for each of your 3 focus students? And 4 separate paragraphs. 1 for the whole class, 1 for focus student 1, 1 for focus student 2, and 1 for focus student 3. And then again, the emphasis on evidence, evidence, evidence. I give you important details, no negative talk about kids. And you can see I give you an outline for how to think about the whole class, how to think about the focus student 1, focus student 2, focus student 3. And then I give you a workbook space down here, where addressing these prompts will line up exactly with the gray prompts from the template. So I do this throughout each of the templates. This is an example from the template on reflection, but you'll find this for each one of the templates that's required. All 5 of the templates I've broken down into this kind of detail. The second part of this, before you do any of the write-up, formal write-up, I suggest you look through the application template workbook. So this is the workbook on application of what you learned. You can see again this structure, sentence starters to support you, giving attention to what I mark as important. Use these tables to set up your own writing for the templates. You can see I've set this one up. The application one is mapped directly onto 1.8. Again, evidence, 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 especially video evidence. And you can see here's the first prompt. Based on your planning, teaching, assessing, and reflecting, do you need to reteach any part of the lesson? Explain why or why not. I give you a frame for thinking about reteaching. Some workspace to consider your reteaching. Give you some examples, sentence starters, and also addressing not reteaching, marking your own successes. And you can see I give you a frame here that maps directly onto the template. Then I follow with prompt 2, and you can see this one's rather involved. Whole class, focus student 1, 2, and 3, and ELD support. You can see I give you some tools for this again. Thinking about higher order thinking, taking notes for yourself, and then I break this down into what you might do for the whole class, what to improve, and then what to keep. A workspace, the same for focus student 1, focus student 2, focus student 3. And then you can see I continue. For this template, there's a prompt around academic language and ELD. And you can see for the whole class, I would like to improve these things with academic language and ELD. Again, keeping and what to let go for each of them. And then this prompt, prompt 3, is about affirming and validating students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds, a little space to work these out, and some suggested starters and some workspace. So this is the last bit before you do formal work for CalTPA Cycle 1. After you've done all this good work about going through the lesson plan frame, all the 8 rubrics, considering the knowledge base, considering reflection template and application template, then you can start doing the work for CalTPA more formally. I suggest you start with Getting to Know Your Students workbook, and this will look familiar again. Again, the sentence starters are meant to support you. Use your own ideas and language, and then you'll see here are the prompts from CalTPA, and then I outline sentence starters and approaches and some workspace. I often will give support links. If they ask about English language proficiency, here's some guides for you and some support down here, and you'll see all throughout this I'm setting out resources. So this is for funds of knowledge within the template Getting to Know Your Students, and I give you some resources for that as well and some space to work things out. So this is the Getting to Know Your Students workbook. Follow with the lesson plan template workbook. Same frame, sentence starters, give attention to whatever I set out that's important. Here are the frames. I give you some support here. You work out what matters to you in your lesson. The other part was about ELD standards. I give a resource link to ELD standards and a suggestion about how you might approach that. And then some suggestions for the content of the lesson based on each of the prompts with support. And you can see that I'm emphasizing elements that matter to Cycle 1. And so this is the lesson plan template. The next piece is the lesson rationale workbook. So you go into more detail about why you're doing what you would like to do in your lesson. Same thing, sentence starters, look for attention I put out. Here's the actual frame for Cycle 1, prior academic knowledge. Here's the prompt. I give you suggestions and some workspace. Number 2, students' assets and learning needs. I break it all down for you, give you some working space. Student learning activities, and then I set out some suggestions for you as well. A workspace to think about the activity, including important elements, higher order thinking. And then in your write-up I make suggestions and then more prompts down here. This is the lesson plan rationale template workbook. And then the last, this is to help you think about your planning as well. You should really know about what is expected in your video. So let's take a look at this one. This is a video annotation workbook. You will be including videos of your teaching as part of your submission, and you will be annotating those videos looking for 5 important elements that matter to CalTPA Cycle 1. So you can see I put a lot of important things here. So the videos need to be about the kids' response to your teaching, not just you doing teaching or them working independently. And these annotations will matter to Rubrics 1.5 and 1.6. So you need to annotate well. Your scores on those two come directly from your annotations. I set out the 5 annotations. The first rubric takes in the first 2. The second rubric, 1.6, takes in the other 3. And here are directions. I put out an important notice. The assessment asks you to make 3 distinct videos. You can do that, but what matters most is that you have elements in your videos that show each of the 5 annotations, those things that are happening in your teaching that reflect those annotations. They don't really matter it doesn't really matter which video those annotations show up in. You just want to make sure that they're present. It's useful to structure your lesson kind of in this way, as an introduction, and then follow with a body of the lesson, and then follow with a closure. But don't be bound to that. Think about the video as what holds the most marks of those annotations for yourself to be able to describe in your submission. I put this list down here. These are things that should show up in your video. And then I give some examples for each of them. So for the first video annotation requirement, it's about creating a positive and safe learning environment. And then I set out some examples. And then I give you some connection to what the rubric's asking for. So this is the annotation. These are the things that are asked for in the rubric. And then I suggest some things that you might want to make sure are in your video. And I do this for each one of the 5. Explaining connections to prior learning, establishing expectations. These are actually 2 different ones, so make sure you think about them that way. Mark every one that shows, every moment in your teaching that shows connections to prior learning as this one. And every moment in your video where you're setting expectations with this one as well. The next one's about engaging students in content-specific higher order thinking. And you can see I suggest lots of good questions here, things you might do. Another important one is monitoring students' understanding of content. I suggest things you might look for, and also ways you might go about your teaching that will support this. And then finally, establishing next steps for students' learning of content. And things you should do, and especially with this one, many students lose points on this because they don't include it. They get to the end of the lesson and they don't leave time to talk about, set out what the next steps are for their students' learning. So make sure you do this one. So at this point, you're working out your lesson plan. Then you want to talk through your lesson plan with your peers, noting all the essential elements in the lesson plan frame. I'll go to that just again for a moment here. When you're doing your planning, you're looking for all of these things, and you might use the structure that I've set out for you. So this is in your planning. You might review all the other materials I've set out. And then importantly, you want to talk through your lesson plan with your peers, mentors, so you have a sense of how the structure of the lesson is going to go about. You have a good picture in your mind, and you have a good sense of where the elements are going to show up in your teaching. Teach your lesson and have a peer or mentor record for you. Emphasize the audio. A lot of the evidence that comes up in the videos is through what people say. So give attention to that. Record the entire lesson. And then you want to review your video using the video annotation workbook. As I shared before, you will see that there are these 5 elements that you need to be looking for, and I've given you descriptions about what you might look for in your video. But to follow along with that, there's also a capture tool for you, and this is to be used while viewing your video on your own or with your peers or your mentor teacher. You're looking for these 5 elements. What you want to do is mark up your video or keep a table like this. I've given you a sample here. In this sample, you can see these are the 5 annotations, and then just simple marking of times when these things happen and a description. And what I've given you here is a table that you can use to do that. So copy this table as you need. Here are the 5 elements. You put in times when something happens, again and again and again. You can add as many more rows as you want. Give a little description, because that description is going to be what you use in your write-up with the annotation. And then I suggest using this table up here to decide which of the 5-minute blocks that you want to submit. You get to submit 3 5-minute blocks, and that table up above is going to help you figure out which ones have most of the elements. And then using this tool, you can set out what video clip 1 does. Okay. These are the 5 things you're looking for. You can mark times in your 5-minute video clips. You mark the element that's showing up in the annotation and a description again. I've given you a table for each of these. Use this as makes good sense to you. And after you've done that good work on video, then you're going to go back to completing the reflection on what you learned workbook, making sure that you pay attention to the rubric that attaches to reflection on what you learned first. So go ahead and look at rubric 1.7, go to the workbook on reflection on what you learned, complete that, follow with looking at the outline for rubric 1.8, and the last template, which is application of what you learned. Remember, the reflection part, what you write for the reflection on what you learned, is your score for Rubric 1.7. What you write on the application of what you learned gives you your score for Rubric 1.8. And then all the work that you've done in your workbooks, take those, take the good writing, the notes, and then go ahead and complete the actual forms that have been given to you by your program. And then using your video annotation workbook and your video annotation capture tool, go to the online interface for CalTPA and go ahead and mark up your video. You might do that with a peer just to make sure you get the right things in the right places. And to close, a self-check. There are a couple self-checks here. So far you've completed all the templates. You've completed your videos after your good teaching. What you want to do is go back to the 8 rubric breakdowns that I've set out before and go and look and see what the rubrics say about the requirements for CalTPA, and just checking to see, do I have this, do I have this, do I have this, and making sure that you write things up and include things that happen in your lessons that you may have missed, that you may have done well, but needed to be accounted for the rubric. And the last piece I have for you is just using the CalTPA Cycle 1 self-assessment rubric. Okay, so I made this one, and if you look at this one, it's pretty straightforward. This is Rubric 1.1. These are the necessary elements. These are level 4 elements, and these are level 5 elements. Check. See how you've done. Remember, for you to score 3, the necessary 3, you have to have all of these elements. If you want a 4, you have to start with all of these, and then make sure you have these 2. And if you want a 5, everything has to show. But you can do that. So this is Rubric 1.1. You see Rubric 1.2, all the necessary elements in level 4 and 5. Level 1.3, necessary elements in level 4 and level 5. Use this to check your work. So one important thing is share your work with peers. Talk through and check through their self-assessment with them. Have them do the same for you. Get support from peers. Don't do this alone. And when you have completed all the templates and done them well because of all the good work you've done on the workbooks, then submit your CalTPA Cycle 1. And I wish you the best. Do reach out to me with questions and comments. I want to support your good work on this and see you successful.